now have the transcripts. We have the actual typed back and forth questioning and answers from David's preliminary hearing. You know, reporting can only get you so far, so we're going to review what we've learned, including the alleged messages between David and Celeste Rivas Hernandez, the 14-year-old girl he's accused of murdering. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. So, Law and Crime and Sidebar specifically have been all over the David case since the very beginning, when it was first announced that a decomposed, dismembered body was found in a Tesla at a Hollywood tow yard back in September of last year. And during David's, the singer-songwriter's preliminary hearing, we had excellent reporting on what was happening inside that courtroom. Details like what David looked like all this time in jail, how family members were reacting to the graphic evidentiary photos. This was all from NBC LA reporter Julia Dang, who did a fantastic job. Remember, there are no cameras that were allowed there. There was no audio equipment. There was no recording. We weren't able to get to every single thing about the witnesses that were talked about. And even though there was great reporting, sometimes to be able to see the transcripts themselves, to see the details, to see how the questions were asked, this is something you don't get every day. We have now gotten our hands on the full court transcripts from this preliminary.
We now have the internal memo. Not a leak to a friendly reporter, not a carefully worded press release, but a raw, unredacted 6-page document from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, dated July 17, 2026. The subject line is clinical. Assessment of unauthorized public disclosure of Bureau personnel actions. The first sentence doesn't waste a word. It reads, "The removal of career employees from the Federal Bureau of Investigation presents a clear and ongoing counterintelligence risk to the United States." You can almost hear the bureaucratic silence that followed. It's a warning that didn't just land, it detonated. And the media detonation was a strange one, a frantic effort to frame this as a routine political transition. But the document in front of us tells a different story. It tells the story of what was officially said versus what was actually signed. Picture a security guard ripping out the mainframe wires, convinced he's stopping a breach, while a massive, silent data siphon is already running on a backup line he was never trained to see. That's the visual of this moment. The very people purged to stop a security threat became the invisible gap in the nation's defenses. Before we go deeper into what the documents actually show, make sure you're subscribed to the VerdictOrigin. Because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence. This begins with a press conference. You see a podium. You hear the phrase, "restoring integrity." The official logic was a clean sweep.
From this preliminary hearing, and we are learning things that we didn't know before. We are getting details that we didn't have before. And I want to dig into those. I want to talk about some of those details because here's where it all stands, right? David Anthony Burke, David, 21-year-old musician who prosecutors allege met teen Celeste Rivas Hernandez and began engaging in a sexual relationship with her. They claim this began when she was just 13 years old and he was 18. They claim that he brought her to this home in the Hollywood Hills after calling an Uber for her on April 23rd, 2025, and that he stabbed her to death after she allegedly threatened to expose him, presumably about their relationship. And he is accused of dismembering her. Her remains were found in an impound lot in a Tesla, allegedly registered to him back in September. And after a multi-day preliminary hearing, a judge has now ruled there is enough evidence for him to stand trial on charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful...
The narrative sold to the public was that a politicized agency had lost its way, and the cure was a rapid, decisive removal of an entire leadership echelon. It's a potent, simple message. Then you place it against the memo. The ODNI assessment doesn't use the language of politics. It uses the language of damage. It details how dozens of senior special agents, whose institutional knowledge wasn't merely about past cases, but about live, deeply embedded foreign counterintelligence operations, were walked out the door. They didn't leave behind a neat pile of briefing papers. They took with them the unwritten tradecraft, the human source validation, the real, time pattern recognition that no database can replicate.
Online began communicating when she was just 11. They reportedly or allegedly had sexual intercourse or relations for the first time when she was 13 and he was 18. And there was a lot of concern in this messaging that she could become pregnant. So here's DA Silverman questioning the detective about a specific text thread. Question. Okay. And the first text that we have here is the victim texting to the defendant currently, and then a misspelling of the word manifesting, my period because I refuse to have kids. Correct? Correct. And then a response from the defendant that says what? Did you miss your date? Okay. And at the top of the next page, same date, 11:25, 10:16 p.m. What does the defendant say to the victim? He says, you should start tracking. And what about at the text right beneath that? He sends a second message that says, use Flow. Do you know what that refers to? I believe it is a telephone application for women to track their period. He says, I know that's why you should start tracking. And then just beneath that, what does he tell her? And now that it's ovulation week for you, it's important. And then on the following page, let's jump down to this text here at 10:18 p.m. What does he tell her? I just need to make sure you're on top of your... And is there a response from the victim? Yes. What does she say? She said, if I'm pregnant, though, I'm not having it. Now, how old is the victim at this time? She had just turned 13 years old 2 months prior. Question by Ms. Silverman. How old is the defendant at the time of those text messages regarding pregnancy and this pregnancy tracker app in November of 2023 when the victim is 13? 18 years old.
The purge wasn't a clean sweep. It was a blindfold. They didn't secure the bureau. They hollowed
13,
it out.
18 years old. So based on these text messages, it appears that Celeste had at least one abortion. Quote, they're talking about a pregnancy. She says, it's okay, though. Don't worry. Neither of us are capable of watching and taking care of the baby. It's for the best, no? And does the defendant respond? He does. What does he say? He says, yeah, I know. And a few hours later, also on January 8th, this is at 10:51 in the morning, does the defendant continue the conversation? He does. What does he say? He asks her, when you going to get it done? And does she respond? She does. She says, 2 days. And after that, does the defendant say anything to her? Yes. He says, also, my mother always told me to ask this question if I ever was in this situation. It's not insinuating anything, so don't get offended, please, but it is mine, right? And what is her response? Of course it's yours, David. Their text message.
That's the irony explosion. The action designed to project strength created a structural weakness so profound it triggered a formal counterintelligence alarm.
Grittier, the more graphic pieces of evidence in this case. And this is when LAPD criminalist Chelsea Murillo was called to the stand. And she was the one who processed that Tesla Model X, apparently that contained Celeste's remains. So from the transcript, quote, I gathered some of the air fresheners that I found throughout the vehicle for a single photo. There were at least 11 throughout the vehicle. Question, and where were they within the vehicle? Majority of them were in the center console. They were also in the rear seats, and there were also some in the front area, meaning the front trunk. So there were actually air fresheners in the front trunk area? Yes. Murillo continues, quote, the top middle is a picture inside of the frunk, and it shows the insect activity and an air freshener. Anytime you talk about insect activity, gives you kind of stages, decomposition, how long the body might have been in there. Okay, and in terms of insect activity, are we talking about things like maggots? Yes. Flies? Dead flies? Yes, okay. In the photograph just below in the center where I see there is a red circle, what is it that you've circled here? That is another air freshener. It's just difficult to see because it's beneath the maggots. So legally, this is important. If you're trying to show this is David's car, how long has the body been in there? Would it have been impossible for him to know if he went to that car at any point or was driving that car? You don't see what's going on here? And why so many air fresheners? Is it to mask the decomposition smell? To show he knows what happened to Celeste, that he did this. That's the allegation.
The parallel narrative is even more dissonant. While one branch of government was issuing a stark, classified, level warning that our human intelligence network was now dangerously exposed, another branch was feeding a public story that a nest of corrupt actors had been cleaned out. The memo specifically notes a heightened vulnerability to recruitment by foreign adversary intelligence services, stemming from the dismissals. Translate that into plain English. When you publicly eviscerate a group of intelligence officers, strip their security clearances, and brand them as disloyal, you don't make them vanish. You make them a target, an angry, isolated individual with a head full of active secrets is the exact profile a hostile agency scores the earth to find. At this exact second, the clock is ticking. So you have to ask the thriller question, right now, as adversarial intelligence services read this same public memo. Which of these discarded agents is receiving the first discrete, untraceable contact? It's not a political headline. It's an operational catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. They didn't secure the bureau. They hollowed it out. Let's go to the hard evidence. Exhibit A is the memo itself, a document we've placed a direct link to in the description. Page 4, paragraph 2, deliberately obscured in most reporting, states that the loss of institutional continuity has degraded the Bureau's ability to identify and neutralize logic bombs within legacy IT systems maintained by the purged units. Logic bombs. That's a piece of malicious code sitting dormant in a system until its creator is gone, waiting to trigger. The assessment suggests that the people who knew where those digital tripwires might be are no longer there to point them out. You fired the one person who knew the building's blueprints while standing inside the gas-filled room. Exhibit B is the timing. The removals were executed with what's called administrative suddenness to prevent obstruction. But that same speed prevented a standard counterintelligence debriefing. The classified knowledge didn't magically evaporate. It was uncorked and scattered into the civilian world, unmonitored and unmanaged.
We know, based on Julia Deng's reporting from inside the courtroom, that horrific autopsy photos were shown to the gallery. LA County Deputy Medical Examiner Dr. Grant Ho testified about the autopsy findings, confirming that his office had ruled her death a homicide, 2 penetrating wounds. He also went into detail about the dismemberment of Celeste's remains, noting that it was possible a power tool like a chainsaw. Remember, there were 2 chainsaws found in David's garage, could have been used. There was also a missing chainsaw as well. But because of the severe level of decomposition, it is difficult to pinpoint an exact time of death or dismemberment. This is according to the doctor's testimony. I did a whole episode on Sidebar about potential gaps in the prosecution's case. No apparent murder weapon was found. You don't necessarily have the tool or tools that were used for dismemberment.
We aren't dealing with a political disagreement about policy. We are looking at a logistical blueprint for a security breach that the government's own intelligence arm said has already begun.
That is when prosecutors got into some of the final messages between David and Celeste. And that includes a profanity-laced message from Celeste where she claims, or allegedly claims, that she would kill David, that she would strangle him, that she would tell her dad lies about him, that she would end his career. All important for the prosecution's case to say, he had a reason to kill her. This appears to have been in connection with David's friendship with another online content creator, Asia Collins, whom Celeste seemed to believe may have been a romantic rival. So then Detective Farrell, back on the stand, read through messages that were sent on the night that the prosecution claims Celeste died. Quote, it says, gate open, door unlocked. This is at 10:10 p.m. and 38 seconds? Correct. About 20 minutes later, at 10:31 and 3 seconds, does the defendant send another message to her? Yes. And what does he say? He says, Uber said you're here. Where are you at? And at 10:33, does he send another message? Yes. What is that? Hello? And at 10:36, does he send another message? Yes. What is that? Bro. And then what? Celeste. At this point, are there no more messages from the victim ever? No. Then at 10:58 p.m., does he send another message to the victim? Yes. It says, what is that? It says, bro, blocking me? And beneath that same time, hello? And then at 11:37 p.m., does he send another message to the victim? Yes. And what's that? Bro. And at 11:41 p.m., does he send another one? Yes. He sends a message that says, I'ma call Jen, bro, you're scared.
Which brings us to the unanswered question. The official line was that these individuals were a threat to national security by remaining inside the building. The government's own classified assessment now warns they are a threat to national security precisely because they were thrown outside it. Both things cannot be true.
Bro, you're scaring me. So this all goes to what the prosecution claims is the alibi text, right? That she allegedly came over, he allegedly killed her, and then he is accused of trying to cover it up. Now, I've talked about this before. Potential gap in the case is we don't know exactly what went down in that house, right? Because you wonder if the defense is going to say, how do you know this was murder? Could it have been an argument? Could it have been self-defense? Could she have done something to herself? Manslaughter? But I imagine prosecutors will argue, look at the timing of when she allegedly arrived at the property and these messages. And they could make the argument to the jury, do you expect Celeste did something to herself? Or David acted in self-defense, that he had to kill Celeste because she was attacking him, and he had the wherewithal and the quick thinking to come up with texts like this so quickly? Jury, does that make sense to you? Now, the defense could suggest maybe he really didn't know where she was. Maybe she never went to the property. There's no surveillance cameras of this as far as we can tell. What happened to her? Or if the evidence is getting really tricky, they could also make the argument he didn't kill her, but he panicked and just something.
You cannot have purged a mortal internal danger and simultaneously created a mortal external one, unless the purge itself was the original act of insecurity.
Just something happened to her, and he tried to cover it up afterwards. We'll see. Now, David's defense also pointed out that while Celeste was threatening, or allegedly threatening, to leak their secrets to the public, there was never any sort of indication that she wanted to go to law enforcement or file criminal charges. So you go to the transcript. Quote, question, David Burke tells Celeste, how are you going to say you feel distant when you've been pushing me away since the beginning of the year? And then there's a crying, laughing emoji, and Celeste responds, no, you haven't. If I see you with Asia one more time on either Paige's posts, etc., you hanging out with her, next to her, anything of that sort, I will make anonymous accounts you won't be able to avoid and leaking all that S I got on you. And Celeste is talking about leaking things online. Answer, that's what the text says, what it says, just like the other text, yes. And Celeste never said one word about going to the police and making any kind of complaint against David Burke, correct?
They didn't secure the bureau, they hollowed it out. This is the gap the press conferences will never fill. So here is the call to research. Go read the ODNI assessment of July 17, 2026, filed publicly to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence as a mandatory notification. Find the paragraph on adversarial recruitment vulnerability. Read it yourself. Then answer one direct question in the comments below. Does that document describe a successful operation to restore integrity? Or does it describe an intelligence failure so massive we're only now learning its name?
There's not enough evidence to move forward under the law. And I am so happy from a legal point of view that we get these transcripts to see the actual arguments. So from the defense, take a look. Quote, Ms. Bednarski says, on behalf of David Burke, we make a motion for insufficiency on all counts, all elements, and the special circumstances based on the evidence. We oppose a holding order on all those counts and elements and special circumstances. On count one, the murder count under 187A, it's required that the prosecution present sufficient proof of malice aforethought. Now, after multiple days of testimony, they produced at most evidence that a young woman's body was dismembered, transported, and concealed, that her DNA, presumptively blood, was found in a garage at his residence and in the lower trunk compartment of his car that traveled north back. This presumptive blood evidence is consistent with dismemberment of a body in a cut-up pool. And while this evidence circumstantially supports concealment of a death, it's not evidence of a killing, much less of a killing by this defendant with malice. This circumstantial evidence, this blood evidence, does not support the requisite intent of malice aforethought. And without malice, the DA may have circumstantial evidence for a type of homicide occurring, but not a 187A by this defendant, so first-degree murder. And Bednarski also argued that the special circumstances applied to this case, lying in wait, killing for financial gain, the murder of a witness, it doesn't fit here. Quote, and here the evidence does not support a finding of killing by lying in wait. Ms. Hernandez knew and expected Mr. Burke to be home. In fact, she demanded to come over. I think we heard a recitation of more than 7 or 8 demands by her insisting on coming over and insisting on coming over on that day. She was asking over and over, and he continued to try to convince her otherwise with excuses like his parents were in town, like she should wait until after his trip to Singapore, asking why did she need to come right now before that trip, repeatedly trying to get her not to go. In fact, telling her no, but she insisted and set the time and place that night, his house. And she also argued that the claim of monetary gain from Celeste's death didn't make sense. Quote, the proof of economic benefit presented here was too attenuated to satisfy the legal standard. The theory appears to be preserving prospective music career, but that is not a concrete financial interest under the law. No California case extends the circumstance here. Special circumstance alleged here to preservation of future earning capacity, and that's the theory here. And she again pointed out that David didn't seem interested in anything to do with his finances. He let other people handle all that. Quote, we heard extensive evidence of Mr. Burke's lack of engagement with his finances, lack of interest, never asking any questions. There is no evidence whatsoever his contract was ever explained to him or discussed. And as I mentioned, there's the argument that Celeste never had any intention of calling the police on David. So that goes to murder of a witness, right? Quote, there was no pending proceeding or case or investigation. And while that's not required by the law, it certainly weakens any inference that was Mr. Burke's subjective expectation. All of her threats were to expose him socially to family and friends, exposed to her father, exposed to people online, going to Val's house and pounding on the door, essentially to ruin him socially and professionally. Never a threat to go to the police or to testify. The threats point the wrong way for the prosecution argument. Now,
This is the VerdictOrigin. If you follow the evidence.
Now, the prosecution had a chance to respond in a rebuttal, and they argued, as expected, the complete opposite of what the defense did, saying, quote, so we're talking about a victim who has been stabbed twice. I can't understand how anybody would believe that you wouldn't notice that. I assume there would have been some vocalization. And during that time, the defendant doesn't call 911. He doesn't call law enforcement. He apparently doesn't call any friends. Maybe he calls his family, but he doesn't do anything to try to save her life. So there's nothing about this case that sounds like an accident. Rather, what it sounds like, based on the argument that's been going back and forth between the defendant and the victim, who in the last 24 hours, once she makes that threat, it appears that he then puts his own plan into motion. Just as we saw, he made a plan to help get the victim out of her home so that she can come stay with him when she ran away from home. He formulated a plan here as well. And we also have to keep in mind, regardless of the fact that the defense tried numerous times throughout this proceeding to try to dirty up the victim, we're talking about a 13-year-old child, and the motive evidence in this case is astounding. So in a preliminary hearing, it is up to the judge to decide whether a case moves forward to trial. Is there enough evidence to support probable cause? The judge announced, quote, it appears to me from the evidence presented that the following offenses have been committed and that there is sufficient cause to believe the following defendant is guilty thereof, to wit, David Anthony Burke. And then it lists out his charges and the penal codes associated with each one, then continues, I order that Mr. Burke be held to answer, therefore. Bail will be set at no bail at this time and be committed to the custody of the Sheriff of Los Angeles County. So
the truth is not coming out eventually. It's already here. Like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an exhibit.